Welcome to the Minelab Expert Series. Dive into the world of metal detecting with us as we tackle both its basics and intricacies, all while posing tough questions to the Minelab engineers themselves. Join us in this thrilling quest beneath the surface of metal detecting. Right, welcome back. Hello. I'd like to thank Phil and Mark and Paul for joining me again. So today the question is all about stuff that I've seen out in the field regarding tones and numbers. So when I've been out in the field, I've seen detectorists and they claim to know what they've found underneath just by kind of seeing numbers on their detector and hearing certain sounds.
I love doing that.
Yeah, Paul will guess at what the item is when we're out together.
Only on the beach. I can't do it.
Well, he's got a sixth sense for the beach. So is it true that a detectorist can how much can you tell from these tones and these numbers? How accurate are they, and what do they even mean?
Okay, so to answer that question, I'll probably start with just going back a little bit and talking about how targets behave under the ground. So if you can recall from the previous video, we talked about having the coil for a coin and treasure detector, and it's sending a transmit signal into the ground, and then it's setting up the little eddy currents in, say, the coin in the ground, which is a bit like a whirlpool, and then you're getting the receive part of the coil back on above the ground that's receiving a signal back. What we use when we're designing what's called a CW or continuous wave detector is we're constantly transmitting and receiving at the same time. And we're looking at both of those signals back at the detector and comparing them. And so we're actually looking at how much has the received signal lagged, or what's the delay between the received signal and that transmit signal. And depending on the target, that delay shifts. So I guess to jump to the very end of the talk, yes, you can gather information from all different targets that tells you what they are based on that delay between the transmitter and the receiver. So I guess the next bit of it though is how does that vary for different types of targets? And so one thing that can happen is the target material has a big impact. So if you can imagine, let's say you've got a bronze axe head from thousands of years ago, that's a very conductive metal. It's fantastic at receiving the magnetic field from the coil above the surface of the ground, and you get these beautiful eddy currents set up, really big and strong, and then they come back, and you can actually tell from the delay that that's that kind of material. Conversely, if you had like an aluminium foil wrapper from a lolly or something like that, it hardly has any metal in it. The material is sort of an aluminium substrate that doesn't really do a very good job of setting up those little eddy currents. So that information can get conveyed back to the detector, so you can sort of tell, okay, that's probably going to be something big and bronze, and that's going to be something small and foil. And that sort of leads me towards the shape. So the next big factor is the shape. You can imagine you've got a perfect coin that's going to have one eddy current on it that's circulating in a nice circle, versus if you've got an axe head which has got a sharp corner to it and a point, you're going to get little eddy currents up around the point, and you're going to get a nice big eddy current back around near the handle of the axe where you've got solid metal. And similarly, if you imagine the foil wrapper, it's probably flat and it's probably screwed up because it's got thrown away. You're going to get hundreds of little eddy currents in a mess all over it that are making a really confusing signal. All of that information goes back to the detector and it tries to make sense of it. And so you can imagine for a coin it has a pretty easy time because it's just got one eddy current. But something complex like maybe an axe head or a foil wrapper, particularly if it's scrunched up, can really start to tell the detectorist, like Paul for example, he's like, oh, this is a bit messy. It's unlikely to be a deep, Saxon coin or whatever. And finally, you've got the actual orientation. So you can imagine when a coin first gets dropped by someone in a field, it sinks down, and maybe it sinks down and settles flat at a foot down, and the farmer's plough never turns it over, so it sits perfectly flat. When the user goes over that, they're going to make a nice eddy current. The detector's going to scream at you, dig this, and it's a no-brainer. However, if that coin over time gets turned over by the farmer's plough, then it can end up on its edge. And when it's on its edge, it's still a coin, but because it's on its edge, the detector only sees the edge, so it only sees the little eddy currents on the edge, and now it's a pretty, what we call iffy signal. So you have to be a bit more of an expert to have a guess, and that's where Paul's sixth sense comes in. He's like, oh, yeah, sometimes when a coin's on its edge, it can make that ID or that tone, or I can hear a bit of a, a whisper of it being a coin, but it's not a very solid signal. So you've really got to think about what is the many possibilities of targets and materials and how they're oriented when it's under the ground.
So it's quite complex with that mixture of things then, like of angle, shape.
And so it's very easy to trick yourself in, say you're in the shop and you're doing what we call an air test, where you've got the detector on the shop bench and you've got some coins and you're showing how well it works, and you've got like a single frequency detector. You could grab one from 30 years ago and make it look good. But in reality, when you're out in the field and it's buried and it's got other targets near it, that's when things change.
You've got your ground conditions and...
Yeah, absolutely. You can get a leeching effect out of targets as well. Probably it's quite exaggerated in seawater, where a target will appear to be much larger than what it is because, sort of the conductive elements of the target have leached into the surrounding soil, creating what some people call a halo effect. And as soon as you start to disrupt that, the target or the apparent target can become much smaller. A target that's been in the ground for 10 years, 100 years, will sound always much better than a target that you've just freshly buried.
Yeah, it makes sense as well. Yeah.
If I can say, if these targets, they're usually the old pre-decimal coins,
right,
at depth. Now, I'll go with the example with the CTX because that's what I mainly use on the wet sand. At depth, if you're looking at your numbers, you've got your ferrous, your conductivity. You will not know this because you don't use one, but you've got your ferrous and your conductivity. At depth, I'll go with the example of a pre-decimal penny. The target ID is 0, 1, 34 to 36. But once you've got the target out the ground, up, and you hold it to the coil, your ferrous and conductivity change. So you've got 1238 out of the ground. So really, you want to be listening for your tones and not relying on your target ID, because at depth and then at coil level, totally different.
Totally different.
Yeah, it's worth remembering Paul's story in a couple of videos' time where we cover ground balance, because we'll actually talk about how the ID can shift. It actually, I think, explains when you take that scoop of dirt out, you're changing the amount of ground around the target, so potentially it's changing how it's pulling the ID over. Anyway, I guess that's probably jumping a little bit advanced at this point. I guess it does relate though exactly to what I'm talking about here though, because there's actually a diagram you can draw where it has where all of the different types of targets live at different angles, including ground. And so for a single frequency machine, that's what it has to work with. It knows that all the targets are on this sort of spectrum of different angles or positions.
And the detector is essentially measuring the conductivity of the target, just how easily it conducts electricity at that stage. So that's why people talk about high conductors and low conductors. They're talking about how well they conduct electricity, how easily these eddy currents are created, and that's where the target IDs come from, is that measure of conductivity. A high conductor will have a very high target ID, whereas a low conductor piece of foil will have a very low target ID. In Minelab world, we use negative numbers to indicate ferrous targets. So those are targets that contain iron, and non-ferrous targets, so these are the bronzes and the aluminiums, the coppers, etc. They'll all have positive IDs. Gold, absolutely. So very small targets, very flat targets, very low conductivity metals will have low target IDs. And then those higher conductors, the large, very conductive materials, say large coins, large silver coins, for example, they'll have the higher target IDs. And then those target IDs can also, in the detector, correspond to tones. So you can set particularly an equinox up for only having one tone, where you'll hear a single tone for all target IDs, or you can go up to multi-tone, where you've got a particular tone for each individual ID, and that allows you to really, in your ears, hear what that target ID is before you look down at the screen.
So you can make the experience quite auditory instead of like visual. Well, actually, do you find that detectorists prefer numbers over sound?
It depends how you've gotten into it. If you've come from old school and you've had a detector without a screen.
Ah, right. Yeah.
So the best way to practice is pull a sock over your screen.
Right.
And just go by your ears.
Use your ears.
If you go by ear, you'll generally be faster because you're not having to look down at the screen and perhaps slow your swing rate.
What you will find is people will dig a lot of a certain target ID number, like if they're digging a lot of bullets coming in 17, 18, 19, then they'll carry on and they'll just ignore the link, 17, 18, it's going to be another bullet.
Oh, okay.
You know, you're going to get other targets that fall in that number range as well.
So how do you decide when to dig then?
The challenge of getting the deeper targets with the pulse induction, you're listening for the really tiny mellow tones. Again, you've got no screen,
Right.
so all you've got is your tones.
Right.
So you're listening for the really faint tones, which are the depth ones. Then on your dry sand, you've got fines which are going to range from like your foil ring pulls.
Right.
And you get that use to what something sounds like. That's why I can guess, like on the Equinox, a 5p piece will always come in at number 11.
Okay. You found
So
a few.
you find a lot of, yeah. So I just look on the beach. I just love guessing
Okay.
what it's going to be on a field because I've not done it that as many years as
As you
what
have.
I've done beaches.
So I suppose what's interesting here
So-
and what's important is that you have a certain tactic in plan and an experience of that location. Well, you don't seem to have the approach that I'm going to dig everything.
I do
everywhere.
on fields.
Right.
On a field because your small cut hammered coins will come in at target ID 1, 2, 3, 4 upwards, which is also the same range as foil
Right.
and small bullets. That's why when I come off a field, I've got a bag full of small bits of foil. It's just a mishmash. That you know you don't want to be discriminating all that out because you're going to then lose your smaller target.
Yeah.
You do have that overlap with target IDs. With something like a CTX where you've got two dimensions that you're measuring, you're actually measuring the ferrous content and the conductivity. You can sometimes split some of those targets a little bit more, but there can be a lot of overlap between targets, and that's why a lot of people will just search in what we say is all metal mode, where you hear all targets and dig everything. That way you ensure that you don't miss anything. The only downside is it costs you a bit more time to do that digging.
I think more in America they have their coin range isn't as vast as what we have, so I think they're better if they're working on numbers. They can say a nickel will come in at this, a silver something will come in at that, and I think they're a lot more precise on that if they work on target IDs more than what we do.
Can I just go back to what you just said there, Phil? Actually, you said the CTX. Does that search in a different way? You just mentioned two things there. I wasn't sure what you meant on that. Sorry.
I think it's a lot more precise target ID number wise, isn't it?
Yeah, so Mark mentioned earlier on that we measure the that lag between the transmitter and the receiver, and that is a measure of the conductivity, the electrical conductivity of the target. The CTX has also got the CTX 3030 has also got some other processing in it, where we can derive that conductivity. We can also extract the ferrous content from that target, and so we can give you two dimensions of target ID, and so that's why the CTX 3030 gives you that two-dimensional screen. And Paul talked earlier on about the two ID numbers that come from that system, so you get a lot of the desirable, the conductive targets will all sit on that same ferrous value, whereas the ferrous targets will move up and down beyond that range.
Amazing. So it illustrates it a little bit clearer. Then that's really good.
something like the CTX 3030 is quite good as well, because you can actually see the movement of the target ID, because the target ID will change as your coil traverses over the top of a target. Because you think if you've got your target here and the coil's out here, it's getting one view of the target. When it's directly overhead the target, you'll get an entirely different view. So you'll actually get a range of IDs as you traverse the target. And a lot of the processing in the detector tries to give you the best ID, but the CTX 3030 will actually show you the variation of that ID as you go over targets. So you can, particularly if you've got two adjacent targets on a 3030, you can actually see the two clusters of IDs.
Does that mean something like Mark's example earlier of the Bronze Age axe head? You know, you've got the different depth of the actual metal there. Would that then change as you went across and it became a thicker target?
Yes, to some degree, yeah, definitely. Certainly if you were only just seeing, if you were scanning but not really over the top of the axe head, you're seeing it from quite an angle. And like I said earlier, that just means your eddy currents are on that angle now, so you might be only seeing the axe from the edge when you're about half a foot from it. So you're going to get a different ID than compared to when you're over the top of it.
Okay, brilliant, yeah.
So basically, how loud a target sounds tells you how big or deep the target is. So imagine you've got your axe head down at 2 foot, you'll only just hear that. It's a massive target, but you'll only just hear it. Conversely, if that was sitting right near the surface and you swept over it, would absolutely scream at you. And so you can use that information of how strong the response is. And also Phil mentioned earlier, if you get 3 blips as you go over a target, you know for sure that that's right on the surface. But a lot of detectors actually have a depth indicator on the screen, which is usually some arrows showing how deep it is. And that's really just telling you how strong the signal is. And it's up to you then to think about, okay, is that like a piece of jewellery that's only a centimetre below the surface and it's still a pretty strong signal, or is it actually that axe head down at 2 foot? So you've still got to make that kind of judgment call. But the detectors do tell you how strong the signal is, both in how loud it is in your ear and how many arrows on the depth indicator you see on the screen.
Amazing. So, really good. So I didn't actually know that volume, like, you know, kind of the reaction of the detector in that way was telling you that. I have seen the depth indicator on the Vanquish. It's got the arrow, and I use that, which is really good.
Detectors can disguise the audio as well, because they're trying to emphasise targets so much that many targets will sound with a loud volume so that you don't miss anything. But generally you can have modes that you can set the detector to so that the audio is much more proportional to depth, and that's possible as well.
But for a simple detector that's meant to be easy to use like the Vanquish, it doesn't have as much control over that, and it's really set up to be very confident, so the users always know to dig, and they don't get all that information, whereas a CTX, it really is quite proportional to depth, is how loud the signal will sound.
I think for a new user, too much
Information.
Yeah, trying to learn too much at once.
Yeah.
You know, you're gonna start playing. Well, if I turn that up, I'm gonna get depth. But then, if you do that, you can create problems with false signals. And
the best way for new users to get familiar with these concepts is actually to grab a few targets and play with them. So try some different coins, try them at different angles, try them at different heights, and you can just do that on your kitchen table at home.
Yeah, the science really makes sense. Right, so I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thanks again to Mark and Phil and Paul, and join us again in the next episode when we'll be talking about discrimination.